Final Fantasy.
Because we were asked, really, to do something educational, a Q&A. So we are here ready to answer, or attempt to answer, questions from our audience, or from one another, too.
Or from us to you.
Yeah, we hope you're ready to answer questions.
I didn't say who was learning.
Hey, that's true, that's true.
Have you always been in Milwaukee?
Rescue?
Yes. What is your history?
Sometimes I take vacations and leave, so I haven't always been in Milwaukee. But I was born here, and then I stayed here until I was about 19, and then I started to try other places. I lived in Chicago for half a year, and came back and went to New York for 3 months, which was like 3 years every place else, and I came back to Milwaukee. I went to San Francisco for half a year and came back to Milwaukee. I went to Berkeley for half a year and came back. And then I met my dear wife, Cindy. And she was in Milwaukee, and sort of, sort of an east side. And since then, I've been steadily in Milwaukee, except for those few vacations. Snuck away. How about you guys?
I was born in Milwaukee.
Yeah.
Lived in Madison for some time, in Illinois, and we've been in Milwaukee, well, teaching in Hartford, but my heart is still in Milwaukee.
Good.
So,
Is not in Hartford.
well, it's in two places.
Okay.
Sure.
I have to ask a question.
Yeah.
Deepen this education experience. I'm curious about how these pieces evolve into having quite distinct characters. And I'm wondering if it is along the lines of jazz improvisation, where you sort of let solos lead the evolution of each piece, or is there a way, can you describe, is there a way to describe the way these things sort of take form?
Well, it's different for every improvisation.
Yeah.
I don't think that there's like one exact layout for that sort of thing. And it's definitely like also like a very individualistic thing. So like, you know, one of us could be deciding to do exactly that, like let the solo lead it, while like, you know, Paul's over here deciding like, no, screw you, I'm just doing Paul thing, you know? Like, so like, it's also, you know, to like, you know, the individual person. I mean, all I can do is like speak for myself when it comes to that. And for me, I do try to hear what everyone else around me is doing. And honestly, sometimes depending where you're at, it's really, really, really hard. But what I really listen for is kind of like a texture. And depending like where the texture is going is what I'm going to do to it. Now, sometimes when there is someone who's like, you know, at the forefront, you know, I kind of follow them. I like to like, you know, either accompany or like try to replicate what it is that they're doing. And sometimes I like to just completely contrast it. And then it also goes for the texture idea. Like, you know, sometimes like, you know, I hear like certain like, you know, more dense texture building up, and I decide to be part of that dense texture, or sometimes I decide not to. But it's just, I don't know, it's different. And I mean, there's definitely times where there is someone who's kind of like more at the forefront, like, you know, moving the piece in a certain direction. And I, like, you know, when things like that happen, I guess the goal of the group is to like, you know, be able to tell that that's happening and let that develop, or not let that develop if you don't want to let that develop at that point in time.
You guys have anything?
wondering about you guys, 'cause I know you two, at least on the same topic.
Well, Jake and I have been doing so much of this now that when we play our music, we know exactly where each other's going. So there's times when I'm definitely being the leader, but with only one saxophone, that's the role of the saxophone. So I've been trying to experiment with a more accompaniment role, especially with other groups.
Yeah, and to answer your question too, I go into it with just a mutual respect and understanding that we're just gonna see what happens, you know? And I know that sounds, it's like, yeah, well, obviously that's improvising in some sense, but I think in this setting, when we all come into it with that mindset, it makes things a little bit easier to when you want to make a decision. You know, when you make a decision to go over here, no one really cares. You just do it, and you do it for the creative and the music's sake. You know, and so I think in this setting, and I tell this to my students all the time. Sometimes it's okay to struggle musically, because in that struggle you're really creating something quite beautiful. So,
Yeah, if anybody recorded that duet with the soprano and bassoon, I thought that could have been a pretty cool composition. So I was trying to play along the lines of what would a composition sound like if for a 21st century piece written for that particular group. And when Rick came up with the bass comment, it just resulted in
Did you say 20th or did you say
21st?
21st? I must have misheard that.
Fast, man.
You know, I think that's a really good question, Elizabeth, because it's something that fascinates me about how these pieces develop.
yeah.
And I think one of the factors that's really important is that, okay, you've got ranges, low volume, high volume, low pitch, high pitch, single voice or many voices, different kinds of rapid tempo or slow tempo, etc. All these, you put all those different possibilities together, and it becomes infinite. So the thing is, like, except for the one-note samba, you've got to play more than one note, you know, and there's a few pieces that really, I don't like that. But basically, you can't spend a whole evening on that. So you find yourself changing pitches, and like when you get something that's very raucous, I myself don't really want to follow it up with something else that's really raucous. I want to come down to either a moderate level or a very quiet kind of something of contrast. So we're always looking for that kind of contrast. And those same principles happen in forms that develop, because they really are forms. They're improvised forms. And sometimes we lose the thread, and that's fascinating too, because then all of a sudden you realize we've lost it, where are we going now? And then there's somebody that comes up with the most certain direction, and usually we follow that person because they've got something saying something with conviction, and I want to hear where they're going with that, so I will feed them something that continues that process, and these things then develop automatically. I wonder if anybody else over in the audience has thoughts on that same subject that could contribute, because I thought it was really a valuable question.
What do you have to say about it, Paul? I know we've talked about it.
Well, with this music too, I approach it, we're kind of touched on the idea of forms, but you can break break down every single musical element to its most raw form. And with this music, we talk about density, we talk about harmony, if you can form even AAB, stuff like that. You can take that super raw element of music, dynamics, and explore just that one thing for you can do it for hours within a context of other players and other music. You can just play around with dynamics. You can't play one note all the time, but what if you played that one note on the entire spectrum of dynamics? Then all of a sudden you have a different level of approach just to that one sound. And that in itself can be interesting to listen to if you throw on a bunch of other sort of musical elements, form, rhythm, all that stuff kind of comes into play then. And how convicted you are to each of those things individually, so it makes the music come across.
Sometimes what causes the change too is, especially as the volume begins to rise, players will find where they can fit into the sound spectrum. Like if one person is playing a certain volume, your instrument may not fit there, so you have to find a different pitch or find a different texture so that you can fit in and still be heard.
Sometimes not playing.
Or not playing. Yeah.
Other comments?
It strikes me that it's the exact opposite of popular music. Popular music, generally people like to hear things that are familiar, and they kind of like sort of reminisce in a way when they're hearing it, and they feel comfortable. And what you guys are doing is the opposite of that. It doesn't really have, there are different forms, there's no familiar thing. Sometimes it seems familiar, it has references and things like that, but it's always something different. I think is a lot more interesting.
That's really good to hear, because the last thing we want is popular.
We'd have a lot more people here.
I want to be popular.
Pardon me, except for Cody.
You know, it's interesting though, because when I'm in a setting like this, and we do get into some kind of a groove, or like almost like a jam band type of thing, there is a comfort level. It's like, oh, okay, we can go on this way. I'm ashamed to sort of admit that, but I think we all have like that comfort zone of where's that pulse? You know, what chord are you playing? Like what's like, oh, I recognize that. You know, like in that last jam when you were I don't know what we were doing, like a little coffee shop like group there, and I was like, yes, you know, this is you know, but it's still different from what we were doing. You know, so I think that's why I sort of like hugged it a little bit more.
Actually, that was my most uncomfortable moment of the night. I started something, now I have to keep going,
Yeah.
and where did he go?
Yeah.
I was there's like one common, like, at least for me, there's like this huge thing sometimes with some people who are like free improvising, where like, oh, you have to always completely improvise, like, you know, going like deciding
Don't play a rhythm.
Yeah, don't play rhythm. Don't play a lick. Don't play anything you've worked on, you've worked out. Don't play in one key at all. You know, or that's not real free improvisation. You know, and I was in this master class with me, Drake, and William Parker, and my first question for them was like, "What's your concept of free improvisation?" And they both looked at me and said, "Well, what's yours?" So like the thing is like at least free improv, it's very personal, and you know, like, you know, you're talking about like comfort zones and stuff. I know definitely for me, and I'm actually not afraid to admit it, there's definitely times where I consciously choose like, hey man, I kind of just want to play in this one key because that's what I'm hearing at this moment. I'm hearing some pretty we've been playing some like, super like dense, like noise stuff for a while, now I wanna play something pretty. And I'm not ashamed to say that, there's some like, free improv Nazi out there somewhere who's gonna be like, oh, that's not cool, you're not supposed to do that, and that's fine, you know what? If that's not what they like, that's fine, that's great, they probably have their reasons and whatever. But, that's what I was hearing at that moment, that's what I decided to do. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I definitely feel that the thing with free improv, as compared, just like for musicians, it's kind of like a real representation of you as a musician and like your skills as a whole. Because like to be there, like, to make something in the spot, and like, it just really represents everything that you worked on, the things that you do work on, and whatever. Because no matter what, like, at some point, like, things that you've already played are coming out. Things that have already happened are coming out. I don't believe that anyone comes into free improv having not worked on their craft in some way, shape, or form. So at some point, something's happened that has been worked on. So, yeah, it's just my spiel.
Do you have any other comments, concerns?
I was just gonna comment that I'm in contrast to what Mark was saying, that there's a lot of people in the back. But I'm delighted with how accessible it is. It may not be popular music, but I find that the tension between the individuals and the perspectives you all have, and then the collective and how the conversation you get going, and it might be just your skills of conversing together, but I think it's so wonderfully accessible. You can sit and listen and really get on board and enjoy it.
I think as a listener, you allow it to, because you're putting yourself in that energy to be receptive to that music, and don't have an opinion before you go into it.
Okay.
And so many culture that's impossible. People just are not in the mindset to experience the music. So we have to teach them.
Well, I've noticed a lot though, working at the Jazz Gallery so many nights, where these, like, people will come in and that maybe it's the first time they ever really saw any kind of music that is intellectually challenging. It's amazing that they usually like it. They like it. It just takes an experience. Of course, that's in the middle of River West, and people are pretty generally open-minded, I would say. But, that's been the largest experience. It's pretty enjoyable.
Well, let's play one more quintet and call it a night. Thanks for your ears.